Week 10 is down. We're on to week 11. We're over the halfway mark. We're into the nitty gritty. Some of your last chances to really cash in on the DFS slates. Look, we get more and more information every week. That's why this show, the DFS Early Look, is so important. It is the earliest you will get a look in the industry. Joining me as always, the man writing the article. It's Jake Tribbey. This week, even though the bye weeks are a little more friendly, there's still some questionable plays here, but I'm looking forward to the breakdown. Jake, let's kick it off with the first player you have listed here. He popped off this past weekend, Brock Purdy.
Yeah, so the DraftKings pricing algorithm, I'm not exactly sure what's going on with it, but Brock Purdy's salary hasn't moved all season, essentially. And that's a huge mistake on DraftKings' part, as Purdy's averaged 19.7 DraftKings fantasy points per game across his 16 healthy career starts. That would rank 7th best among slate-eligible quarterbacks this season. Keep in mind, he's priced as the quarterback 13 on DraftKings, quarterback 9 on Fanduel, so he's a very strong technical value, but he's also faced with an outstanding matchup. We just saw him go off last week against a top 3 pass funnel. This week, he's facing Tampa Bay, another top 3 pass funnel by pass rate over expectation allowed, and the Buccaneers rank as one of the 10 softest schedule-adjusted matchups for opposing passers. So this is another outstanding spot for a quarterback who has been consistently underpriced on both sides, but especially DraftKings. I know, obviously we're mostly fantasy analysts, but especially in NFL circles, like film watching circles, I was talking to some of our charters. They said last week was arguably the best game Brock Purdy has ever played. So, more than happy to buy into Purdy on the, after a fantastic outing, especially because they just won't move his price up.
The dot to George Kittle was a thing of beauty. And if he just keeps playing like that, you're going to get an insane value. Like you mentioned, QB 13 and QB 9 respectively is kind of wild. The next quarterback we have on the sheet, I'm not surprised he's down there. He had his glow up game and it's been kind of back and forth, up and down a little bit, but Will Levis, 5,200 on DraftKings, that's QB 17. 6,600 on FanDuel, also QB 17. You're buying down here a little bit with Will Levis, but let's talk about it.
Yeah, so, this is really just a tournament play. Generally, I'm trying to, point out the chalk, point out some of the best values. But Levis, I think, is very interesting because when the cards flipped over on Sunday in week 10, Levis was the 3rd highest owned quarterback in the Millionaire Maker at 11%. He wasn't a bad play in a vacuum. He was facing one of the league's premier pass funnels, which was why we sort of talked him up on cashing points as, a potentially pretty strong, sneaky tournament play, assuming his ownership was low, but it wasn't. And he certainly wasn't deserving of top 3 quarterback ownership on a relatively deep quarterback slate. We're faced with that again in week 11, a deep quarterback slate. And, of course, Levis flopped last week, scoring just 7 DraftKings points with a 53.3 passer rating. So, that probably means his ownership's going to come down significantly in week 11. And all that said, he's basically in the exact same spot this week. Jacksonville is a top 3 pass funnel by pass rate over expectation allowed. And like I said, we don't expect Levis to draw much ownership again after he killed thousands of lineups last week with his brutal performance. Assuming he doesn't get steamed industry-wide, I do think the very volatile Will Levis is worth a shot in tournaments in a pretty strong matchup, mostly thanks to his hyper-aggressive and league-leading 11.4 average depth of target. Prior to week 10, he had played 2 games, and across 8 quarters, I thought he was a pretty strong, he looked pretty good through 7 of them. So I'm willing to take another chance on him this week, but really only if he's projected for low ownership. So, he's a guy you'll want to keep an eye on during the week, see how many people are talking him up, see what sites are on him. And, if he's not really getting mentioned anywhere and, you're making multiple teams, I think he's worth a shot. But, if he somehow ends up being popular again, there's no way I'm touching Will Levis.
Yeah, he's definitely a player you have to watch the market for. 100.
Oh, yeah.
He got gassed up last week. Let's switch it to running backs. One of our favorite players, one of fantasy football's favorite players. No, it's not Keaton Mitchell. It's the original Keaton Mitchell. It's Devon Achane.
Achane.
It's been so long, I forgot what his name is already. He's coming back off of the IR, reported more of a sprain than a tear, so he should be 100% go, which means we know that 10 plays is good enough for 30 points with how he was. The Dolphins' offense, though, has been struggling to get consistent elite production. We're back in on Devon, though.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, he's been activated off IR, and that means he's likely going to play this Sunday. That opens up a 21-day practice window, and from the sound of it, Mike McDaniel said it was only a sprain; it wasn't a tear. So that makes me think that he's probably if he isn't 100%, he's got to be very very close. So there's a very real chance the Dolphins get him back on the field at his old workload in Week 11, and we can't forget. He averaged 33.6 fantasy points per game and 12.3 yards per carry during the 3 games he earned multiple carries prior to going on IR. For this week, he's faced with a Raiders defense that ranks as the second softest schedule adjusted rushing matchup for opposing running backs, and they're allowing 4.6 yards per carry. Now, of course, there's always a risk playing a guy who's coming off IR in his first week back. But at the same time, Achane has upside where if he goes off, there's a pretty good chance that you just won't be able to win without him. You mentioned Thomas, the Dolphins offense had been struggling a little bit recently, but part of that could just be because they're missing one of their best playmakers in Devon Achane. Yeah, like I said, it's a little risky, but running back 9 on DraftKings, and especially in tournaments, I think that's more than worth the risk.
RB9 for the opportunity to finish as the RB1 by a mile is worth investing in. Just like we don't play fantasy football worrying about injuries, we don't play DFS worrying and being concerned about possible injuries. You play for the maximum upside all the time. Speaking of which, I don't know what, as you mentioned earlier, they're doing with the Lions here, but 6,000 RB16 on DraftKings, 6,600 RB21 on Fanduel for a top 10 running back on the year seems a little bit out of pocket. Rashad White has been touted by fantasypoints.com since the preseason, and people are continuously slow to catch up. Let's talk about Rashad White and why he made the list.
Yeah, so over the last 3 weeks, Rashad White has been the running back 5, running back 1, and running back 13 by expected fantasy points, averaging 19.4 expected fantasy points per game over that stretch. His volume, both on the ground and through the air, has been fantastic, especially as of late. He's earned 20 carries in each of his last 2 games. He's gone over 45 receiving yards in 4 straight games. And he has one of the best red zone roles in football. His 89% snap share inside the 20 this year ranks 4th among all running backs. It's glaringly obvious, as you mentioned, that he's too cheap on both DFS sites. But he also draws a top 8 schedule adjusted receiving matchup this week in San Francisco. Over the last 4 weeks, Rashad White has actually averaged 12 receiving fantasy points per game. That's more than Chris Godwin, T. Higgins, and Puka Nacua. And he should get fed as much receiving work as he can handle this week, with Tampa Bay listed as a 10.5 point underdog against San Francisco. And again, a pretty solid receiving matchup for running backs. I mean, I think Rashad White's going to be one of the 3 or 4 highest owned running backs on this slate. He's just glaringly underpriced.
He has a check down king playing quarterback, and that is so valuable when you look at running backs and how they're used. Speaking of which, running backs with how they're used, this looks like a pure usage play because the offense not very good. But we're talking about buying way down. DraftKings 4,900 RB26, FanDuel 6,000 for RB28. Canadian Chuba Hubbard. Let's talk about how Chuba made the list.
Yeah, so Hubbard pops as a pretty solid value on this slate because, again, he's just so cheap. Over the last 2 weeks, he's earned a 65% snap share, 51% route share, and 16.6 expected fantasy points per game. Over the full season, those numbers would rank 13th, 8th, and 5th among all running backs. Obviously, the results have been pretty bad. Hubbard's only averaged 9.9 fantasy points per game. But he's seeing volume that's dramatically better than his price on either DFS site. The matchup isn't great this week. It's a bottom 10 schedule adjusted matchup against Dallas, but it's still not bad enough to overcome his sub $5,000 DraftKings salary. really the argument for Hubbard here, beyond, he's a solid value, is that he's going to enable you to pay up for multiple stars with the salary he saves your lineup. I mean, we've all been in a position where we make a team and we need to save salary somewhere. Sometimes that unfortunately ends up being the running back position. And, generally below 5,500, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. Hubbard, getting low end RB1, high end RB2 workload, type numbers at 4,900, I think that's pretty reasonable, obviously, depending on the construction of your lineup. I think he's going to end up being a pretty strong value. And like I said, he could just help you get up to the guys you really want to play.
Right. And that's equally as important than finding, the top guy. Let's talk about some wide receivers and possibly one that would be a better running back than wide receiver. I think he'd be a top 10 running back in the league personally, but it's Deebo Samuel. He's back, scored a rushing touchdown, shocker, this past weekend. DraftKings 6,300, wide receiver 18. Fanduel has him a little higher, 7,100, wide receiver 14. We mentioned the matchup for Brock Purdy. This looks like a smash spot, which projected high ownership with Brandon Ayuk. Matching him up with Deebo Samuel, very smart. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think both, San Francisco wide receivers could be argued as pretty strong plays this week. But, I went with Deebo for a few reasons, which we'll get into shortly. We just saw San Francisco go for 437 yards of total offense at home against one of the league's top pass funnels in Jacksonville. This week, they get another home game against another one of the league's top pass funnels in Tampa Bay. Now, of course, Deebo Samuel didn't do a whole lot last week beyond that touchdown in his first game back since week 6. But the matchup in week 11, it really is right in his wheelhouse. Tampa Bay is the third softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing wide receivers. That's significantly better than Jacksonville, and they run zone at the league's 6th highest rate. Last season, Deebo Samuel earned targets at nearly double the rate against zone coverage relative to man coverage. Add in the pass funnel, the plus matchup, and a pretty reasonable price tag, especially on DraftKings at only 6,300, and it's easy to get behind him as a solid play in week 11.
Yeah, that offense is just an offense I want to be attached to all the times. When you get good matchup and a great price, it's just Hammertown for me. Next up, another wide receiver that's been on this program multiple times. The offense is, some people might think, overachieving, but they have just looked outstanding from top to bottom in even Devin Singletary is tearing it up for games with Houston this year. So we're going to go with Tank Dell, who 5,900, wide receiver 23, 7,000, wide receiver 17 over on FanDuel, not getting the respect he deserves, which is prime pickings for DFS DGens. Let's talk about Tank Dell.
Yeah, so Tank Dell has ranked top 4 among all pass catchers and expected fantasy points in each of the last 2 weeks. Over that span, he's posted a 40% first read target share, which is 4th highest, on the back of 12.5 targets per game, which is 4th most. You could argue that his volume has been aided by the recent absences of Robert Woods and Nico Collins, and that's probably true to some extent. But it's also true that rookie wide receivers are typically far more productive in the second half of their rookie seasons. So it's very possible that we are simply seeing Dell cement himself as an alpha target earner, injuries or not. For this week, he draws an Arizona defense that ranks as the 3rd softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing outside wide receivers. I mean, we've been targeting Arizona all year, and I don't think there's any reason to think that a Houston offense that's been absolutely crushing all season would, not put up points against Arizona. So I'm expecting another big game from Dell, who is far too cheap relative to his recent volume.
He's just been an absolute smash like the rest of that offense. And again, they're late to adjusting, which means we have to be just as early to be on top of it. Let's talk about tight ends. And once again, we're going back to a familiar well. It's the Arizona tight end show and a true breakout. There was speculation the breakout was more because he was Dobbs, safety blanket and check down. And then we look at his usage again this week with the returning Kyler Murray. Absolutely crushed and broke slates. Let's talk about Trey McBride, 4,400 at tight end 6, 5,900 tight end 5. There's some real opportunity here.
Yeah. So, we love Arizona tight ends on this show. And a big part of that is just because they're the focal point of this Cardinals offense. McBride was a featured element of the offense in weeks 8 and 9. We saw him ranked top 5 among tight ends in usage and target share. But week 10 saw the return of Kyler Murray. And the overall improvement that Kyler provided to the Arizona offense has only furthered McBride's value as a fantasy asset. On Sunday, he earned 28% of Arizona's targets. That was one of just 16 games this season where a tight end has posted a target share at or above 28%. And somewhat unbelievably, McBride is actually responsible for 2 of those games over the last 3 weeks. For week 11, McBride draws a top 5 matchup in Houston, and Arizona should once again be forced to throw as 4.5-point underdogs. I think that's one of the things McBride has going for him is overall this team isn't very good. They're playing from behind a lot. They have to throw a lot, and he's just getting peppered with targets. We know he's seeing high-end tight end 1 volume, and that will make him a screaming value and one of the most popular tight end plays of the week, or maybe just one of the most popular plays overall in a very strong matchup.
I just don't think we're ever going to stop touting Arizona tight ends. I mean, unless for some reason Zach Ertz still somehow becomes tight end 1 when he comes back, then maybe we'll wane off. But shame on Arizona if that's what they do. Jake, let the people know when the article drops. Maybe they've read it already. Maybe they wait for the podcast version. And what else do we have for the DFS side on fantasypoints.com?
Yeah, so the DFS Early Look will be out Tuesday. Should be up on the site by noon. I'll have DFS Study Hall out on Thursday. I also have DFS Values that'll come out on Friday. Keep an eye out for Scott Barrett's DFS Slate Breakdown. That's the best overarching view you can get of everything. That's all our information put together. That comes out Saturday morning, and then of course the best DFS show in the world, Cashing Points, Friday night, 7 p.m. Eastern. That's really can't miss TV. I mean, that's the best show in the industry. Me, Grant Barfield, Scott. Just talking about the slate, giving our best tournament plays, the cash plays. We have all the info, giving you all the best stuff. So yeah, we got great content here at Fantasy Points. Everything you need for DFS right here on this lovely website.
You also are going to want to get into the DFS Discord at Fantasy Points, which you can do through subscription at fantasypoints.com. It is nonstop DFS degeneracy through and through from the start of the week to after. It really is a beautiful sight to behold. For myself, for Jake, this is the DFS Early Look. We cannot wait to see you guys again next week with the industry's earliest look at the DFS slate. Good night, everybody.